Hey, welcome back. So today I'm going to try to answer the question that everyone asks everyone that's ever owned a scooter, which is how fast does it go? And obviously, because I've got the Malossi MHR exhaust on there now, myself and others want to know how much the top speed has actually changed versus the piece pipe. So I'm going to go ahead and put a brand new belt on there today, just to make sure belt wear doesn't limit that. And I'm going to take the shims out of the variator because I normally have my variator shimmed out a little bit because I prefer a better launch versus worrying about top speed. Top speed doesn't matter that much to me. This is more or less curiosity, just to see what the difference is for me. And then I'm going to take it down the road and find out what it does with GPS. Oh, here he comes. My dog hates the air gun because it hisses at him. Stop that. Bad. It's done. This belt's actually pretty close to spec, but again, just because it's a speed run, I'm going to replace it anyway. And all of these shims that were between the drive boss and the fixed half are going to move to the outside of the variator underneath of the starter pawl when I put it back together. Leave it. No. Stop. Stop. Good job. This is why I don't normally run it without shims in the variator, because you can see I'm missing a little bit of belt travel here in the rear pulley, and that can have a negative effect on the launch. Back up. No, hey. Alright, getting my phone and my GPS started up and resetting the data on there. That way I won't have any false top speeds or anything. Well, apparently the GPS is screwed up on the phone again. This is an old iPhone 5. I just got it working again with GPS and now it is already messed up. Well, hopefully the other one works. I think I got 72.9 on there. Let's see what this thing picked up. This one says 71. Alright. Reset this again, see if we can get another one in here or not. I know the gauge is going to be wrong this time because I saw it flash up to that, so that's definitely wrong. Get it out of there. Max speed 70 this time. Alright, resetting this stuff and I'll give it another try. Got 71.8 there, and then 72 here. Alright, so one last time, reset this, 0. So this says 70.9, 14,110. I actually thought that was probably when I was taking off, but I just realized it's getting 14,000 RPM at speed. And this one says 70. Well, now it says GPS strong. Perfect. Max 71.4 on this thing. Who knows when it actually came on. So 70 to 72 miles per hour across multiple runs on GPS. When I tried the piece pipe, it was 67.7 miles per hour. I only did one run with that. But you could say something like 3 to 5 miles per hour improvement with the Malossi exhaust versus the piece pipe. But I'm wondering if there's more in there or not, because it's revving all the way out to 14,000 plus RPM at 70 miles per hour. And as I saw with my tuning, it looks like it likes to stay 13 to 13.5 for the best performance normally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump all the way up from 4.75 gram to 6 gram sliders, and I'm going to see if I can get the RPM any lower up there. It may be that things are just maxed out and that's as good as it's going to get without changing gearing, but it's a pretty quick swap, so I think it's worth a shot. Okay, so 6 gram sliders in here now. This is reset. Maybe it'll work this time. And this is now reset. .9, 13.4, 73 on that one, and 73.3 on that one. My fastest run was 73 miles per hour, and that was at 13,300 RPM. So the 6 gram sliders did work. They definitely lowered RPM, because before I did 72 miles per hour at 14,000 RPM. So 13,300 RPM is right within that zone between 13 and 13.5 that I'd said before I found the peak power at when I was tuning. So I don't think I'm going to get a whole lot faster. I believe that it is basically horsepower limited to a little over 70 miles per hour at this point. Some people in the comment section seem to believe that I should be going 80 plus miles per hour with this thing, and that I just need longer gearing in order to get there. I don't personally believe that. Again, I think this is horsepower limited as is, and I think longer gearing will probably just slow me down in acceleration runs. But currently I'm at 11.2 to 1, roughly. I'll correct myself on the screen with the exact ratio if I'm off. And this thing stock had 10.13 to 1 gear ratio. So it actually had really long gears for a long case scooter with big wheels stock. So I do have the option of going back to stock gearing and finding out if that makes any difference. The only reason that I really don't run those gears is because, as I've shown you when I put this engine together early on in this series, I run a third support bearing in my gearbox that this one doesn't normally have, and that gives me a lot more support on the primary drive shaft to make the gearbox stronger. So I really don't like running the other gear set. But I think I'm going to go ahead and give it a try. Again, I don't think I'm going to get anything out of it, but I don't claim to know everything. And if you watch race teams, when have you ever seen a race team build something, show up at a track, never tune it, and just go out to race? It doesn't happen. That's because even those guys don't know everything there is to know. So I'm willing to try it. We'll see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and do some CVT cleanup and checks before I get into swapping the gears and the transmission. And I wanted to show you this because in the last video, some people noticed that the scooter was really loud, and I was actually pretty sure of why, but now you can definitely tell this is the reason. So this is the support bearing that's in the CVT cover for these Chinese Minarellis, and I guess the actual Yamaha jogs had them as well. And I kind of hate these things because they always go bad, and this one has gone bad. So if you listen when I spin it, that's definitely going to make a lot of noise at a high RPM. So that's where the sound should have been coming from. Also, this piece that you're seeing in the center, I make an aluminum adapter. I use a larger bearing inside diameter than normal and make an aluminum adapter so I can get a pretty snug fit on both the bearing and the shaft, because I found that these shafts wear down. The primary drive shaft will wear down, and then that'll get loose. So these little aluminum adapters inside of the bearing and on top of the shaft allows me to get a pretty snug fit of both and maintain a snug fit without having to replace drive shafts. But anyway, I'll go ahead and replace that, and I might make a new adapter here or bushing, whatever, if necessary. And this adapter is not fitting very snugly at all on this shaft anymore, so I'll make a new one of those up as well. There we go. Nice shiny new part. It's not super tight, but fits pretty snug on there. Now that it's back together, I can show you why I don't like this dual bearing setup as opposed to the 3 bearing setup. So again, this one has a bearing here, and normally it would have a bearing under the CVT cover here supporting it, while the other one has the bearing here, there, and another one inside the gearbox on the other end of the shaft. So here is how much play you get, and this is not a lot of pressure, just wiggling this around. There's that much movement in this shaft. As I was taking the clutch and the rear pulley apart to clean them, I noticed a bit of a problem. You can see here on the ends of each one of these clutch shoes, we've got some contact issues, and they seem to correspond with here on the rear pulley. So if you recall past videos when I was trying to do some clutch tuning, I don't really have room to just add more spacers to move the clutch further away from here. So I think what I'm going to do, I don't want to grind the face of this down. I assume they put those ribs in there for strength. So I'm going to leave those there, leave those alone the best I can. Instead, I'm going to take the clutch apart and I'll grind off a little bit of these corners at least. And as I do it, I'll weigh them to make sure that they're all still even weight. It appears that I have bigger problems than I initially realized. So this shoe was a pain to get off. As you saw, I had to heat it. And this peg that holds that shoe is very loose in here. You can see the others are tight. They're not supposed to wiggle around like that. I would imagine I could probably go back here and weld this and get it secured, maybe make do. But it also looks to me like this back plate may be warped. I dug around. I seem to have one stock clutch left, at least that I can find right now. This one's already been modified. As you can see, I've drilled it out to lighten it. So I think I'm just going to go with this one. I'll still take it apart, I'm probably still going to go ahead and grind down these edges in hopes that this one doesn't hit like the last one did. And I'll weigh all this stuff out as well and probably put stiffer clutch springs in because I know these are 1000 RPM clutch springs. This clutch came apart a lot easier and seems to be in better shape. Doesn't look like it's warped to me. All these are snug, no issues there. I've weighed each one of the clutch shoes individually. They all come out roughly 159 grams. There is some variation across them. But hopefully that'll work out well because the shoes that I were using in the old clutch were also about 159 grams. So you never know if it'll work the same. But again, I'm going to go ahead and grind some of this edge off here, hoping it doesn't hit the rear pulley, and then try to get this back together. So I got the edges ground down, cleaned the shoes up again, and I took them to 157 grams a piece. So now I'm going to put it back together, and I'm going to use these Koso 2000 RPM springs. If you remember in the past from my tuning, I actually had no idea what clutch springs were in there. I knew they were probably either the Koso 1500 or 2000 RPM, but I'm just going to go ahead and throw the 2000 RPM springs in, and at least now I'll know what's in there. Now that this is back together, I'm going to mount it to the rear pulley with no contra spring in place, and that way I can easily see if there is any kind of contact when the rear pulley is opened. It looks like I've got mild contact somewhere, because hopefully you can see the clutch kind of raises up when I get to the top of the travel of the rear pulley. So I've tried looking all around between the clutch and the rear pulley, holding it up to the light, and I don't really see anything hitting. If I had to guess, it almost looks like this lip on the cover here, the lip that would go around the contra spring, may be hitting the pulley, the clutch itself. So I'm going to take this cover off and see if the same thing happens or not. Looks like that's it, because now there's no movement. When I get all the way up to the top there, I don't see the pulley or the clutch pushing up off of the pulley. So apparently this lip is just a little too tall and it's running into the clutch. So you can see this cover is just large enough that it looks like it can contact the corners here, right by the spring pockets, these little corners. I don't think it would hit anywhere else, maybe close, but looks like it would just probably be contacting right there. I only took a small amount off of those corners. It looks like still with this spacer out, I can't quite get that all the way to full travel without hitting the clutch. But took this off again, and I looked at this in the clutch, putting it in the way it would normally go, and there's hardly any gap between the top of this cover and the clutch. So it looks like if I remove just a very, very small amount of this lip here, then it will probably be a non-issue. To be honest, I'm not sure if this will be an issue anyway, because when the rear pulley is opened up, this clutch should have gripped into the bell long ago, so it should be open a little further, and this may slide right through there at that point, may not be an issue, but just to be 100%, I'm going to try and put this in the lathe and see if I can knock just a little bit off that lip, not a whole lot. I took 30 thousandths off of that lip, and it looks like this can sit down inside of my clutch now, and it can touch all the way up against this back plate. But still, I've got something making contact just before the end. Doesn't look like very much. So again, it may be that when this clutch opens up that it's a non-issue. But I think for now what I'm going to do is I've got a pretty thick spacer in there, and I had made a bunch of them up when I was doing a lot of work with the Dr. Pulley clutch especially. So I think I'm just going to use a thinner spacer, whatever the thinnest spacer is that I can get away with, and I don't have contact in there anymore. I've got a calculators page on 49ccscoot.com, one of which happens to be a gearing and speed calculator. So just for fun, out of curiosity, I went in there and plugged these numbers in. I used the tire circumference for my 130/70/12 tire, which I've got a calculator for that as well. And I used 14,000 RPM and plugged in the 11.2 to 1 gears and got 71.7 miles per hour at 14,000 RPM. And then I switched it over to 10.13 to 1 gearing, and that said 79.2 miles per hour. So 7.5 miles per hour faster, possibly, with the 10.13 to 1 gearing. One thing I do want to mention about that calculator, that would assume that you have a 1-to-1 drive ratio in your CVT, which it may or may not work out that way. Actually, the 14,000 RPM numbers turned out pretty close to what I got with the 4.75 gram sliders in actual speed. I did change that when I put in heavier sliders, so most likely my CVT ratio changed a bit then. But at any rate, I think it's a good comparison tool. It shows me that I am capable of probably 7 to 8 more miles per hour more with the gearing set that I'm about to put in there. That said, I'll be surprised if it doesn't, because I just don't think I have the horsepower, but I should have the gearing capability to do it. So we'll find out what actually happens.
Alright, I've got the 10.13 to 1 final drive gears in here now, and it's got 4.75 gram sliders in it at the moment. And the wind is extremely calm, like none of the flags are moving at all right now. So resetting my GPS stuff here, and let's see if it does anything different. So that seemed unimpressive. 13,350 RPM, 69 miles per hour. Let's see what the ones under the seat say. 68 miles per hour. And 68.4 miles per hour. Reset all this stuff. Try them again. Okay, so that time 72.5 and 72 and 71. One last time. Okay. 70.6, 70, and 70.1.
As you can see, I got 68 to 72 miles per hour across a few runs, 13,300 to 13,400 RPM at speed. So not very much different than what I saw with the deeper 11.2 to 1 gearing. And as I thought, it seems to be horsepower limited. I just don't think it's got the power to pull me any faster than it is right now as it's set up. I think if it wanted to go faster, it could probably do it with the 11.2 to 1 gearing with the 6 gram sliders in there, because they still had maybe 700 RPM before they should have quit pulling totally, based on what I saw with lighter sliders and those deeper gears. So I could have switched around sliders in this case just to see if it made any difference, but that seems to be right within the power band peak power that I found in my other testing. It looks like somewhere between 13 and 13 and a half should be where it peaks, and that's right where I was, so I don't think that's what is holding it back. Plus, I actually really wanted to get these gears out of there because going down the road, I could hear a noise and I could feel a lot of vibration that is not usually there, and it was pretty clear that it was coming from the gearbox. The sooner I can get these gears that have less support out of there, the better as far as I'm concerned. And I can show you a few clear examples of why. Here's the first one. This is the noise it's making just rolling it around, and this is after only 35 miles of riding for my test runs. Here's the gear oil that I just drained out of there, and again, this is 35 miles compared to hundreds of miles on the gear oil that I drained out with the third support bearing that didn't look nearly this dark. And the play in the drive shaft has gotten noticeably worse. With over 1,000 miles on the third support setup with this 86cc engine, I really didn't have much play in the primary drive shaft, and then you can see what the difference was with a standard setup with just 35 miles since I had swapped it. So clearly the two bearing setup just doesn't deal with the stress of anything higher horsepower very well, or higher torque, higher speed. The third bearing setup definitely helps there. I would recommend it to anyone that's using one of these long case Chinese clone engines. You can see the results for yourself, but I think probably the standard setup works fine for something like stock to 70cc sport kind of builds, but beyond there, definitely consider the third bearing support. The roughly 10-to-1 gears did do a better job of keeping RPM in check when riding around cruising, so that could be kind of nice to maybe take some stress off of the engine that way, but it comes at a price, which is the aggressive feeling that you get with the deeper gearing. So it's not that it feels soft with the 10-to-1 gears, but it just isn't as snappy or as hard of a hit when you get on the throttle with those gears, at least for this setup. And I really enjoy that part of it. To me, if I'm going to have something fairly race-oriented, I want that aggressiveness when I jump on the throttle. I did stop and do a set of acceleration tests because I wanted to be able to actually time the 0 to 30, 40, and 50 mile per hour performance. That way I could compare it to what it did with the 11.2-to-1 gears. So let's take a look at that. Here's the info average from those runs. So you can see that it's slower than the 11.2-to-1 gearing by 0.3 seconds to 30, 0.4 seconds to 40, and 0.9 seconds to 50 miles per hour. What you may also notice is that the RPM doesn't stay in quite as tight of a range as it did when I had the deeper gearing in there. It actually drops the RPM once it's up to 50 miles per hour, so it's not in its peak power band at that point. I do need to point out a few things to be fair. First of which, I didn't do a bunch of tests with different rollers or sliders to find out what worked best with a 10.13 to 1 gear ratio. It could be that I could improve those times considerably with just the right weights in there. The other thing is the clutch. Obviously, I just had to replace the clutch. The clutch definitely felt different to me. I don't know exactly how much it threw off the times, and unfortunately I can't really test. I had planned to go out and then test again once I had the 11.2-to-1 gears back in, and then I could compare what it was doing with the deep gears versus the 10-to-1 gears. Unfortunately, that was right about the time that the stay-at-home order for Maryland took effect, so I'm not really supposed to be on the road unless it's considered essential. Now, to me, it's essential that the scooter does wheelies and takes off hard, but I don't really think I can convince a law enforcement officer of that. So I probably won't get to test that anytime very soon. I'm well aware that a lot of people are not going to think 72 to 73 miles per hour is very fast for something classified as a hyper race scooter. So first off, to me, while this is considered a hyper race, if I look up parts for it, they come up under hyper race. I would call it more of a race setup. And the hyper race stuff to me, the very high-end hyper race stuff, is the stuff like when you see people buying Malossi C1 cases and Team Cristofellini stuff, and they've got the motocross inspired cylinder designs and all that stuff. They are kind of another league above what this is, and those are a lot of the ones that are doing very, very high speeds, because some people have said a hyper race should do 80 to 100 miles per hour. Well, usually when I see that kind of stuff, it's those builds, the very extreme end of it, and this is not that. Another reason I think that everything I own is 10 to 20 miles per hour slower than the same setups for everyone else is because I try to be as honest and as accurate as I can with this stuff. I try to do it in fair conditions, which means I try to find a road that is roughly flat, and I do my best to go out on a day when there isn't a whole lot of wind. Because I'm sure I could go down a slight decline or a big hill or get a 20 mile per hour tailwind behind me and show you some elevated numbers that I could never do on a flat road without the wind. But that's not what I'm aiming for. I'm trying to show you what this scooter does in fair conditions. And that's also why I try to use a couple of sources of GPS. If you've been watching my videos, you've seen me enough that it should also be obvious that I'm not a really small guy. I'm about 6'2" and 300 pounds, so I weigh as much as some couples do. That doesn't have a huge effect on top speed, but it does have some effect, and it has a big effect on acceleration. Lighter riders would get much, much quicker results in my acceleration runs than I do. But even for speed, aside from the weight, I really can't get tucked down like some people can. I've seen pictures of racers where you basically just see a helmet sticking up above the handlebars. They're tucked down pretty much everything but, eyes up above the handlebars, and I really can't do that. In fact, here's a look at me trying to tuck down. This is basically how I'm tucked on a scooter when I'm doing a speed run. So when you take those things into account, it's not likely that I'm going to ever do 80 miles per hour with something like this, even if I do swap some stuff around. By no means am I telling you that this thing is maxed out and there's no more to be had from it. What I'm saying is, for what it is right now, and for someone my size and the other circumstances, I think I'm getting a pretty reasonable result. Also, this is not the most aerodynamic scooter that you'll ever see. Here's a look at the front end. You can kind of see that the front is dished in. It's also a pretty tall, pretty high setting scooter, so it's really not ideal if you're out there looking to do speed runs. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is I don't think a lot of people understand just how much power it takes to go fast on a scooter, or on any vehicle for that matter, because horsepower demands increase exponentially as speed increases. So what I did is I found an online calculator, and it's not on my site, but I put a link in the description for you. And that allows you to use the drag coefficient, the frontal area of the vehicle, the weight of the vehicle, and the speed to calculate the horsepower required to make it to that speed. So I wanted to be as accurate as I could, so the first thing I did was I got out a bathroom scale and a shipping scale, and I put the front wheel on the bathroom scale and the rear wheel on the shipping scale, and that let me weigh how much T2 actually is. It looks like this scooter weighs in somewhere between 200 and 210 pounds, depending on exactly how much fuel is in there. And I know that I weigh 300 pounds, a little more with gear, so we might as well just say 500 pounds for a nice round number as the weight of the vehicle and the rider. I also wanted to try and be as accurate as I could with the frontal area of the scooter. So that one's a little more trouble. What I did was I actually drew up a little picture of the scooter, a little kind of silhouette of the front of the scooter. And then I took a bunch of time trying to take a whole lot of measurements across the front of the scooter and figure out what the frontal area of the scooter itself was. I came up with about 3.5 square feet for the frontal area of this scooter. And then once I had that information, I wanted to find out how much the area was with me on the scooter. So what I did was I took a picture from the front of the scooter, I put a grid across it in a paint program, and using known measurements, I sat around basically counting the squares in the grid and came up with the area of the entire package, me on the scooter, and that comes out to about 8 square feet. So now I've got an accurate weight for the scooter and the rider. I've got a fairly accurate frontal area. I know the speeds that I want to plug in, so the only thing left is the drag coefficient. And the drag coefficient is not something that a dude like me is going to figure out in his garage. So what I did was I did a bit of searching and I found a site that had some generalized information for automobiles and motorcycles about drag coefficients. And I used 1.0 because basically that's the poor end of aerodynamics for a motorcycle. And T2 has a lot of flat and concave areas on the front, so I'm pretty sure it's at the poor end of aerodynamics. So those allowed me to plug that stuff into the calculator, and now I can show you a chart of horsepower versus speed. If you take a look at the chart, you'll see that it would take about 19 horsepower to reach 70 miles per hour. And then I actually specifically plugged in 72 miles per hour because I reached at least that speed on every one of my speed tests. And it says that that would take about 20.7 horsepower, which I think is pretty well in the ballpark of what I should expect out of this setup right now. You'll also notice that to get to 80 miles per hour, which some people think I should be able to do, I would need about 8 more horsepower, 7.5 more horsepower than I have right now. And some people have mentioned 90 to 100 mile per hour scooters. Well, look at the number for 100 miles per hour. It would take 54 horsepower to reach 100 miles per hour at this point. That's a lot of horsepower. That's not something I'm going to do with a bigger carburetor or any simple mods or probably anything I do to this thing ever. But then I got curious to find out how much difference certain things made. So first I tried plugging in 380 pounds. That would be like this scooter with a 180 pound rider, a fairly average rider. And you can see that didn't really make a whole lot of difference. Even at 100 miles per hour, you're only talking about 0.4 horsepower. So the weight with the speed doesn't make a huge difference. But what I started thinking about was, imagine a lighter rider that could tuck down lower than I can tuck down on here. So maybe they remove a full square foot of frontal area from the scooter. Now look what happens. Then you can see that instead of 20.7 horsepower to go 72, I only need 18 horsepower. So I've freed up basically 2.7 horsepower just by having someone that can tuck down lower or is a little more narrow, etc. Then I started thinking, well, T2 sits pretty high up in the air, so imagine if I lowered that thing down to the ground like you see some drag scooters, and think about how fast it could go then. What if I could take a full foot of frontal area off of it? And I actually did try to look at the numbers based on what I had already calculated, and it looks like I probably could take about a foot off of it if the thing sat pretty much on the ground. And now look what happens. So now it only takes 15.5 horsepower to go 72 miles per hour. That's more than 5 horsepower less. So that starts to take me down from a hyper race build to now something like a mid-race build should be able to do that kind of speed if it were on a smaller scooter or a lower scooter with maybe a rider that could tuck down a little more and a rider that weighed a little less. But more importantly, just reducing the frontal area. So there's all kinds of reasons that people can be much faster than I am. You can see here clearly though, just a smaller frontal area would make a huge difference. So do please take that into consideration before you tell me how slow this thing is. I understand it's not the fastest scooter in the world. I've never claimed that at all. I'm just showing you exactly what I get out of my modifications and trying to share it with you. With that said, I appreciate you watching. Everybody please stay safe out there. Please like the video and share with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you enjoy it. Thanks again.